in your discussing with businesses or in your research to the book, um, what have you found some of the successful stories? Like where have you seen innovation coming from odd places? Like what would you say? What have you found?
Well, I'm glad you asked that. So the book is filled with really interesting stories that you haven't heard. So it's not featuring Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg, and nothing wrong with those guys. Like Netflix is awesome, but everybody knows that. In the book, I cover fascinating stories of people that you don't know. I cover the story of three people who were working on their doctorate degree in a small lab at the UC Santa Barbara that came up with a way to significantly improve the processing of food. So it turns out that 1 of 9 people on the planet don't have enough stuff to eat, which is awful. And as population increases, that problem's only going to increase. But a lot of it has to do with food spoilage. So fresh fruits and vegetables spoil, as we know. And that actually 40% of the world's food supply goes to waste due to spoilage. So if you fix that problem, everyone has enough to eat. So these 3 everyday innovators started tinkering and figuring out and asking questions and getting curious. And they started thinking, well, how does nature protect fruit? Well, every fruit and vegetable has a peel. They say, well, what does the peel do? It keeps the oxygen out and keeps the water in. Well, and they started, again, asking questions, getting creative. What they ended up doing is coming up with something called a peel sciences, where they take the natural elements of the peel, it's all organic, and have a spray that goes over an avocado or a grapefruit or banana or a strawberry that improves the life of that peel by 3 to 5 times, which means that food doesn't spoil and gets to people who need it. The company's raised all this money, and they're now valued at over $1 billion. And so it's uncovering the stories like that. And the cool part is that everyday innovation is happening in every sector. In the book, I cover how an ex-con, who was a drug lord that was put in prison, launched an incredibly successful fitness company. I cover the story of a guy in London who barely got through college who's making a massive difference in the environment. And so we sort of travel the globe together and uncover the stories of these fascinating, incredibly creative people that have enjoyed real success and made a meaningful difference, yet they haven't broken through to celebrity status. And to me, it's so encouraging because we can relate to people like that. I don't know about you, but it's hard for me to relate to someone who made $80 billion. But I can relate to people who have done cool things with their own grit and determination and creativity.
Interesting. And in your observation, what are some of the tenets that you have found common across all these stories that you can say, okay, maybe that's the precursor to something like outlandish coming?
Yeah, so the cool thing is that I did find those commonalities. Thank you for asking. And in the book, we cover 8 core mindsets, core philosophies, core obsessions of everyday innovators. And so the whole second half of the book, after we cover the research and the foundation and such, is really based on these 8 core principles. And there's some of them are kind of surprising. One, just to share a couple, I mean, one of them is called use every drop of toothpaste. And the notion here is around being resourceful and using your ingenuity instead of relying on external resources. You said earlier, many people say they want to be creative, but they don't have enough time. I hear this all the time, by the way. I don't have enough fill in the blank. I don't have enough money. I don't have enough bandwidth. I don't have enough talent. I don't have enough raw materials. But think about this. If the amount of external resources that you had equaled your creative output, the federal government would be the most creative organization on the planet, and startups would be the least. So we know that isn't true. And we know that there's ways to be gritty and scrappy. And sometimes those resource constrained situations drive more creativity. A couple other ones, just since we're chatting about it. One of them is start before you're ready, which is the principle, instead of waiting for a directive or permission or an assignment or till you have ideal conditions, when you see a problem, you just start getting after it, fully recognizing that you don't have all the answers yet and that you're going to figure it out as you go. So it's a sense of being willing to be agile and adapting and course correcting and pivoting as you go, but taking the initiative to get going quickly. So these are just a couple of the themes. There's a couple other fun ones. One is called Don't Forget the Dinner Mint, which is the notion that if you plus up a work product by just a teeny little bit of extra creativity, it can have a disproportionate net result for you. So each of the principles is backed up with research and fun stories and techniques, and it's both fun and practical at the same time.
Interesting. And if you, I'm curious, like, what's the role of, say, abundance or frugality when it comes to being creative and innovative? Like, have you found any relation with that, with how innovative a particular company or a particular person is?
Yeah, so that's a really thoughtful question. I think that philosophically, people with their abundance mindset, that's helpful to driving creativity. Because when you think about scarcity, you're very much like worried about what you're lacking or going to let go of, as opposed to thinking that there's abundance in the world. So I think an abundance mindset is helpful. That being said, I don't think you need an abundance of resources. In fact, sometimes frugality of innovation drives better creativity. That's funny. I started writing code. I know you write code, but like I wrote code in 1983. And at that point, I had 48K of memory, not 48
Mm,
meg, not
mm,
48 gig, 48K. And so
mm,
what would happen is we kept running out of memory. So you had to make really efficient code. Like I'd have to go remove a comma to make sure that the code, like I didn't run out of memory. Today, with unlimited memory, we don't have that problem. And I would argue that the code of the past perhaps was written in a more elegant way. So there are times when abundance of resources doesn't necessarily drive creativity, but an abundance of thinking, a mindset of abundance certainly does.
interesting. And in your journey of preaching or spreading the voice on being creative and innovation, what are some of the things, some of the bottlenecks that you have seen businesses struggling with, that are, you say, okay, these are very easily, some of the excuses, you can call it, or you can call it bottleneck, whichever, however you want to see it. What are some of those, if you can share some?
Yeah, you brought one up earlier where people are really heads down. They're just, I'm doing the work of today. I got to execute. And there's nothing wrong with execution, by the way.
Mm,
In fact, my first book was called Disciplined Dreaming, which is the
mm,
notion that you really need both of these, the yin and yang there. You need to have rigor and discipline or you got a problem, but you also need to have some creativity or you've got a problem. And so what I recommend in the same way, if you invest, even if you have a small portfolio, most people have a balance. They don't put everything in one stock. So you sort of allocate resources accordingly. You might have some in really safe stuff. You might have a little teeny bit in more risky stuff. So leaders are better off thinking about their investment of resources in a similar way. And so you might say, okay, I'm going to invest 80% of the time in really just heads down work. And I'm going to invest another 10% of the time in pretty safe stuff that's a little less heads down, maybe future oriented, but still pretty conservative. But take 5 or 10%. That's when we really need to. I think it's our responsibility to be thinking about the future. In fact, one of my arguments, I wrote a piece long ago about it, is that every company should have a chief startup officer, not a chief
mm,
innovation officer, chief startup officer. Chief
mm,
innovation officers are hired and they have these big dreams and they quickly get sucked into the whirlwind and they're trying to hit next quarter's earnings targets with innovation. So they end up closing their aperture very tight on short-term gains, incremental gains. They say, we got to protect the past. A chief startup officer, all they would do is think about what would the company be? What would it look like, the company that would come along and put us out of business? What startup is going to wipe us off the map? And let's go become that. And so someone who has no line responsibilities, no ability to focus on, they're not even charged with anything within the next 2 or 3 years. They're charged with reinventing the future. I think it's a crucial role that really isn't being filled in most companies. But I think the headline here is that, yes, we need to be heads down at times, but we also need to be heads up.